Hey.
Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Choose Inclusion for our Black Voices Matter series. I'm here as always with my friends Ubaldo and Mike. Say hi, guys.
Hey, everybody.
Hey, welcome back.
So I'm really excited about the guest that we have today, Tolonda Tolbert, who we affectionately call Dr. T. Tolanda's one of those folks that you keep on hearing about her in the DEI circles but she's such a jet setter that you never actually get a chance to meet her in person. So you only hear about her and get to read about her and hear all the thought leadership that she's putting out there. And then one day I was lucky enough to bump into her in Denver, and I was like, this person's amazing. And I just wanted to make sure that we figured out ways to work together. So just to give a little background on Dr. T, Dr. T actually spent 17 years at the Anti-Defamation League and also worked on Wall Street, providing long-term strategies for DEI initiatives for Fortune 500 and Fortune 1000 companies before she last year co-founded a startup called Eskalera, which again is working to use data science and evidence-based findings to define and discover how implicit bias is working within a company, so you can actually start making changes within a company. So really excited about having Dr. T here. Dr. T, welcome.
Thank you. I appreciate you all having me.
So I wanted to, the first question we always ask our guests is just to check in, really. How are you feeling?
I have been, I've definitely been better. About 2 weeks before the George Floyd incident, murder happened, I definitely, with the Ahmaud Arbery situation, had gotten very shell-shocked from the kind of lack of response and watching somebody be hunted in the street in broad daylight. And then, you know, along with the George Floyd situation and the Amy Cooper situation, which to me was also just, it was right up there because it was so sinister what was going on with her, and this, you know, seeing this flip, this switch being flipped in her around race and weaponizing it and so forth. And so you know, it's been a long haul. And there was a time period where I was definitely not able to manage as well as I would have liked to have managed. One of the instances that I am very troubled by is just that, you know, we are dealing with you know, generational trauma, and to see it on a loop on the television is really brutal. So you know, I'm from a generation that also saw, you know, Rodney King and Amadou Diallo get shot 41 times. You know, I remember James Byrd being drugged behind a truck for 3 miles. And so to see this kind of culmination that has been happening for so long happen with Breonna Taylor, Sandra Bland, you know, Tanisha Anderson, all of these people, and many of them people don't know the names of, was a very difficult thing to navigate, both personally, you know, within my family, because I come from a male-dominated family. I have 4 brothers. 2 have had direct incidents with police brutality. And I have two sons that are 17 and 13, and are 6 foot tall and have been since they were younger. And so the worries, both personally, family wise, and then professionally. I've been doing this work for over 20 years and really just feeling like, what more do we have to do? And so it's been a really difficult time, but this time does feel different. The global recognition of what's going on really gives me hope. People looking at their own governments and how race plays out in them is a really positive thing, because I've had the honor of living abroad for many years, and oftentimes people are like, no, that racism stuff just happens in the States. And it's like, oh no, it's here too. Why are all of your poor people darker skinned than everybody else? And so the seeing who is showing up at these rallies was an important part of it for me, and seeing the white community come out in droves and put some skin in the game was a kind of key turning point, along with the global recognition, for me to kind of like, okay, we have to continue to march on and use this opportunity.
Yeah, so I mean, I think one of the things that is getting probably the most media coverage right now is the structural racism in the police system.
Yeah.
But you were talking about it. It just goes way beyond that. Can you speak a little bit more to what that means?
Sure. I mean, one of the things that I've been struck by is just, I feel like the conversation of structural racism is really interesting. There's been a really uneven discussion around structural racism, and I very much liken it to COVID. It's something that up until now, people haven't, if you haven't been personally impacted by it, they're not so invested in eradicating it. And so the conversations around structural racism have really lacked. They've been focused on policing and the prison industrial complex, and that is definitely manifestations of structural racism. But structural racism really, it encompasses so much more than those institutions. It shows its face in a lot of our institutions, and people are tending to talk about it right now as systemic racism happens out there, but we all play a role in systemic racism, and some people play a role where they are the targets, like the Black community and Latinx community and so forth. And some people their role is as anti-racist allies. And some people are agents, the gatekeepers who either consciously or unconsciously try to maintain the barriers to an inclusive society. So, I mean, to me, the truth of the matter is that structural racism is not happening over there. We are all part of it, and we're all impacted. And very much in the same kind of vein that COVID is operating in, it's going to take both individual and kind of collective accountability and action to actually dismantle it. And so I just feel like people don't get that, we are all playing a role in kind of systemic racism. Everybody is inside of this system. And as we, are beginning to have the conversations and understandings about those kind of contours of the negative impacts of racism for Blacks and Browns, as targets, whether those be financial or emotional or social or physical, literally taking tolls on our bodies and our lives. There are negative impacts of racism for everybody, and even the agents and the people who are really trying to maintain those barriers to inclusion. And so one of the, and I feel like there's a lack of discourse around them because, and we can really see these things happening to people around us or on Fox News, you know, for people who are trying to maintain these racist institutions and practices, you know, they really operate in a false reality. They, you know, are operating with incomplete or totally false information about the world and the people in it. And therefore, you know, when your information is false, you don't make rational decisions. And so they suffer from that. You know, with this false reality, they can't see opportunity or talent, if you're talking about the workplace, in others. And they limit themselves because they isolate themselves from people who are different from them. And so they have these very limited social interactions. And so they don't get exposed to things like that diversity of thought. And that ultimately limits how much they learn and how much they grow, how much they can adapt to our world. They develop less empathy in general, and they operate in this space of unnecessary fear and anxiety that really impacts the quality of relationships with those who are different and impacts how they walk in the world. And so like things like that, I feel like I want to make sure that people understand that structural racism impacts everybody, including those people who are, you know, trying to keep, you know, those gatekeepers. And so I feel like that when we talk about this structural racism, we have to have a lot more clarity on what it means in order to kind of dismantle it.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's truly an introspection happening, right? Not only for us as individuals, but as, you know, organizations, for example, who have to, like, this isn't, to me, I don't know, my opinion is that this is a either or kind of conversation right now. This
Yeah.
isn't a, well, it's not a nice to have. I mean, what do you say to people? And I don't know if you get this feedback or not, but I imagine there's, you know, there's a lot of feedback, especially from white people who are saying, "Oh my gosh, this is so overwhelming." Yeah, I mean, you know, what do you say to somebody like that? How do you respond to those types of emotions and
Mhm.
responses? You know?
Yeah, yeah. It is overwhelming, and it's really overwhelming to live with it your whole life. And so it's overwhelming right now because you know, when you find out this kind of new information that you've been taking part in, and then you don't know where to start. And so I think that that's an important aspect of it. And I just feel like if you are able to see the different aspects of structural racism, you can kind of apply your realm of power to dismantling it in a lot of ways. And so, you know, we have some key elements that really keep structural racism in place. We have, you know, these ideological components of structural racism, those core ideas that create that premise that, you know, African Americans, Blacks in general, globally, are inferior in general. And that validates why we don't have power. And so these narratives that have been going on since the 1600s of Blacks being like, they're savages, they're animals, they're uncivilized, are key. And we still see those narratives happening in the media and so forth. And those ideas of when people are watching, different kinds of riots and things on TV, and you listen for these things that are the ideological basis for the structural racism, and you can see people are saying words around, how are they, they're so uncivilized, and, they're acting like wild animals and so forth. And that you'll see throughout every place. And that's some place, to me, that we always want to give people the tools to interrupt that narrative, because those ideas of savage, animal, uncivilized, have, those are really some of the roots of structural racism. And we see that as early as the 16th and 17th century, religions, debated if Black and Indigenous people were humans. And these ideas of Blacks being soulless savages and non-humans really helped to justify the brutal treatment that we received during slavery and today. And so, so anytime you kind of hear those things, I want those things to be red flags to people when they hear the media saying things around Blacks being, wild and, not being civilized, or whatever the adjectives are that they want to put towards it. The meaning is always the same, like somebody to be controlled because they can't control themselves. And those ideas, questioning them and interrupting when those ideas are proffered, really become critical to kind of interrupting systemic racism. And then, of course, those ideas get embedded into the institutions. These ideas of Blacks being uncivilized is what fueled the economy, right? So they came up with the mid-Atlantic slave trade and Jim Crow and sharecropping. And, our economy still is, as we see in COVID, the people who are often on the front lines are people who of color, who are doing manual labor and so forth. And so it still is showing its head through our economy. Another institution that is, kind of beyond also, the police and the prison system is just government, and how those ideas get manifested in the government. And of course, we remember when Blacks were considered chattel, and then progress was 3/5 of a human. That was progress. And, we've had laws on the books about mixing races up until damn near the 80s. And we still see these ways that government institutionalize racism through voting rights, and those things being put down, and weakening of voting rights laws, especially in the South, and the gerrymandering that goes on. Those kinds of things are representative of how the government has really institutionalized racism. And so those laws are something that we have to pay particular attention to. And then, people often talk in these discourses more around, the fairness of all of this and so forth. And we're really not talking about people, these aspects of institutional racism have been going on since the beginning of the United States. And so it's really important for people to understand that it's not necessarily their personal, that they personally did something, but they are personally accountable. We have had these structures, these institutionalized structures that have been excluding Blacks for just so long, from a lot of what I would call white affirmative action, laws that really helped put the working class whites into middle class. Things like the Social Security Act. This is, the opportunity for people to save for retirement and all of these things. It specifically excluded agricultural workers and domestic servants. And guess who were agricultural workers and domestic servants in the 30s? This is when the Social Security Act passed. And so, these kinds of structures that marginalized communities who have had the least opportunity to save, least likely to have pensions, most vulnerable to economic recession, were systematically excluded from these protections and benefits granted to most Americans. Things like the Social Security Act weren't even amended to include all workers until 1955. Whites had a 20-year head start on retirement. This is when my parents are around. We're not talking about, centuries ago. We're talking about things that are embedded in our laws. The same thing happened with the right to unionize. It excluded and this was also in the 30s, it excluded non-whites, which really locked Blacks and people of color out of the middle class, higher paying jobs, denied those protections and benefits, medical care, full employment, job security, all of those things, barring them from even, trying to do better and get ahead in the United States. These laws started being changed in the 50s, but, even the impact of those laws around unions, unions remained white well into the 1970s. And so it just becomes like one of these things where, okay, again, in this, when people want to kind of compare, like, well, why is this happening to people of color? It's been happening to people of color. And so, and even things like the Federal Housing Authority. And this was a program that was subsidizing low-cost loans for home ownership. And, this is the basis of the American dream. And the government set up an appraisal system that really tied property value and loan eligibility explicitly to race. I mean, explicitly, like, you can't get these loans unless you're white. These things weren't even rectified until 1988. And we see that still people of color, are on the bottom of the pile during the housing market crash with the predatory lending and gentrification, etc. This stuff shows up not only in government, in science, in public health, education, among many, and the media, among many of the institutions where, we have this kind of racism that's embedded in it. And so I think that is something that definitely fuels how people treat Blacks and people of color based on these ideas of inferiority. And then, that gets kind of manifested in how people not only treat them, but and also just how, Black children struggle to claim their racial identity in a positive light, because when somebody has said, hey, your people are animals, and these institutions are, marginalizing them, and people are following me in stores and clutching purses when I'm around and doing microaggressions to make me feel like I don't belong, then, it's hard to get to a positive place about how you feel about yourself in this society.
Yeah,
Dr.
everything, this
T.
is, yeah, go Mike, go for it. We're probably going to say the same
Sorry,
thing.
buddy. Yeah.
No, go.
Well, this is, I'm such a history nerd, and I love the history lesson. Thank you so much, because I truly believe that these generations, right? So even from Social Security Administration to fair housing, like we're still reaping the injustice and inequities of those laws today. And so I totally buy into that. However, you started with, whites and organizations putting some skin in the game, and really some financial skin in the game. We're hearing just on the podcast alone of organization CEOs that have never spoken up about Black Lives Matter before, not only speaking up about it, but also donating large sums of money, because at the end of the day, all of those laws that you're talking about are financial and economic instruments of oppression.
That's right.
And now we have white CEOs of really large companies who are saying, yeah, for us to rise, this will raise the boats, for all. We need economic support. And so I'd love to get, kind of your thought process on that.
Absolutely. And I couldn't agree with you more. So what I'm feeling right now is, 20 plus years in the business, my main concern is really sustainability. And so these perfunctory kind of statements from organizations don't mean a lot for me. But, putting that skin in the game, investing where it needs to be invested, and it not being called affirmative action. Like I said, there's affirmative action for white people all the time. That's our history, And so I feel like not only can they put their money where their mouth is in this, in supporting communities, but this has got to be. Often I even worry about that, because it becomes a checked box or window dressing to say, hey, look at me, I'm not racist. And so this, sustainability is key for me. This is not a one and done. This is not about a lip service thing. To me, integration is the name of the game. And they need to change their culture in their organizations. These people don't have people of color and Black people at the top echelons. They are not recruiting people. The way they're interviewing people is biased. How they identify talent is biased. How they develop, how they advance people, how they pay people. All of these things need to be looked at. And inclusion is really something that, it's 101 little things that you have to do to create a culture of inclusion. And the people have to invest long-term. And so right now, during this economic downturn, a lot of organizations are cutting, budgets and cutting jobs. And again, who are those budgets, for D&I in organizations and those jobs? There are so many, in particular, women of color that are being let go, and budgets that are to do this important work being cut at a time where it's even more important to put those things to work in your organization. And that's why our organization, Eskalera, really believes in, one, you have to develop this deep self and social awareness around othering and marginalization. You have to go beyond people just being aware into actually giving them the tools to do better, and making this ongoing learning instead of a one and done kind of situation, and really investing in monitoring the culture in real time to track sentiment and cultural change and behavior change. And that's the beauty of technology right now, is it gives us those abilities, and then giving the employees the tools to change their behavior. We give people evidence-based behavioral nudges and tips on how to do inclusion, because it's my belief that people want to do better, but they don't know how to do better. And it's about the things that you do and the things that you don't do. And so our inclusion index measures all of these things in organization. And we're right now, if people go to eskalera.com, giving people 3-month free access to our training, just so that they can really build that stamina to have really effective conversations about race and racism.
This is, for our audience, I mean, this is one of the most important episodes we've done on this, because I think, Dr. T, you've really honed in on and given individuals a starting place to really understand why this is a thing and why this change needs to happen. I think other guests have sort of talked about it, and we've talked about it, and but this felt to me like a true fine point. The whole discussion around the systemic way that this is permeated in every single thing that we do as a country. Mm-hmm. And where I think people who are asking the question, and leaders and organizations who are asking the question of, well, what can I do? Like, what do we do? It's looking back at yourself and back at your organization to, I think, figure out exactly where all those systemic issues live. And it's gonna be everywhere. But that's, I think, where, as organizations, our audience of leaders, I think that's a huge takeaway, and that's a huge eye opener for me from your conversation, Dr. T, is that, like, if you want to figure out how to help, it's one, it exists, there's no question. And two, now you got to go figure out where it exists in everything that you do every single day in your company.
That's right.
And start there.
Absolutely.
And that's huge. And the 3-month training, like, everybody should be taking that. It starts there, right? It starts with awareness and understanding and education.
Absolutely. And the 3-month training, I mean, it's great because you basically are going through little 10-minute nuggets of things, and then being, here's what you do, try this out, do these tips. Like, I mean, it's like, if you're looking for direction, as that's what we know, that people need. What do I do now that I know? And that's the important part.
Yeah, completely agree. Oh man, Dr. T, thank you for this conversation so much. It's just continues to be such a learning journey for me personally, but it's like I don't know. Thank you. That's all I can say.
Absolutely. It's my pleasure, and keep doing the good work.
You too, Dr. T, and thank you so much for joining us. And thank you to all our listeners who came in today. We will be posting this episode onto our website, chooseinclusion.com, and you'll also be able to download it on Apple Podcasts and on Spotify, and see closed captions on YouTube. So we're going to continue the Black Voices Matter series this afternoon and every day until the foreseeable future. But thanks again for joining us. We'll see you next time.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Dr. T.
Take care, everybody. Thanks.